I arrived home from my job at the marketing firm to find my pregnant cousin Whitney moving into my childhood bedroom with suitcases and baby furniture. My mother, Carol, announced Whitney needed the room since she was having a baby and I should grow up and move out at 22. I stared at my pink walls being covered with nursery decorations, my college awards being thrown into boxes, and my mother treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home, while praising Whitney for bringing new life to the family. The next morning, I woke up on our uncomfortable living room couch with a crick in my neck and the sound of Whitney directing Carol on where to hang baby mobiles in what used to be my sanctuary. I'd spent the entire night tossing and turning on the lumpy cushions, listening to them, chatting and laughing upstairs like old friends planning a sleepover. I stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee, hoping to clear my head and figure out what had just happened to my life. That's when I overheard Whitney on her phone in the backyard speaking in a completely different tone than the sweet, helpless voice she used around Carol. "Derek, you should see how easy this was." She laughed into her phone. "I told Aunt Carol I was desperate and homeless, and she practically begged me to move in. I've been planning this for months, babe. Free rent, free babysitting, and she's already talking about helping with college funds for the baby." My blood ran cold. I pressed myself against the kitchen window, straining to hear more. No, Ruthie has no idea. Carol's been so easy to manipulate. Every time I visit, I drop little hints about how selfish and ungrateful Ruthie is, how she doesn't appreciate family. I even cried a few times about feeling unwanted. Carol ate it up. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. For months, Whitney had been systematically poisoning my mother against me. I thought about all those family dinners where Carol seemed distant, all those times she made comments about me needing to be more family-oriented like Whitney. Whitney continued her conversation completely unaware I was listening. "Oh, and get this. I've already been sleeping in her bed for a week while she's been working those late nights. Her sheets are actually pretty nice. Egyptian cotton, I think." My hands started shaking. A week. She had been in my room, in my bed, going through my things for an entire week while I was pulling overtime at the office to save money for graduate school. I heard Carol's footsteps coming down the stairs, so I quickly moved away from the window and pretended to be searching through the refrigerator. She walked into the kitchen, carrying one of my photo albums. "Ruthie, honey, Whitney needs some space in the closet for her maternity clothes. I'm going to box up some of your old things." "Mom, those aren't old things. That's my college photo album, my sorority pictures." Carol's expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. Whitney is family, and she's going through a difficult time. Her boyfriend isn't being supportive, and she needs us right now. You're 22 years old, Ruthie. It's time you started thinking about someone other than yourself. "But Mom, this is my home too. I live here. I pay for groceries. I help with utilities." "And now you can help by being supportive of your cousin. Maybe this will teach you some responsibility." Whitney walked back into the house at that moment her phone call finished. She immediately put on her sweet, vulnerable act, placing a hand on her growing belly and sighing dramatically. "Aunt Carol, I hope I'm not causing problems between you and Ruthie. I know this is an adjustment, but I just don't have anywhere else to go." She glanced at me with what looked like concern, but I caught the brief smirk that crossed her face when Carol wasn't looking. "Nonsense, sweetheart. You're not causing any problems. Ruthie is just having trouble adjusting to change. She's always been a little selfish, but she'll come around." I stood there in shock. Selfish, I had been helping with household expenses since I turned 18. I had taken care of Carol when she had her surgery last year. I had never asked for anything except basic respect in my own home. "Actually, Aunt Carol, I've been thinking," Whitney said, settling into a kitchen chair and rubbing her belly. "Since I'm going to be here for a while, maybe Ruthie could start contributing more to the household. I mean, if she's going to stay, she should probably pay rent like a regular tenant would. It would help offset the costs of the baby preparations." Carol nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very mature suggestion, Whitney. Ruthie will need to discuss a rental arrangement if you plan to continue living here." I could not believe what I was hearing. "Mom, I already contribute to this household. I buy groceries, I pay the electric bill, I clean the house." "That's just basic responsibility," Carol replied dismissively. "Whitney is suggesting real financial contribution. rent money that can go toward preparing for the baby. Whitney smiled sweetly at me. I'm not trying to be difficult, Ruthie. I just think we should all do our part. I'll be contributing by taking care of household tasks once I'm more settled. And of course, the baby will bring so much joy to the family. Over the next few hours, I watched in amazement as Whitney continued her performance. She complimented Carol's cooking, asked for advice about pregnancy, and made subtle comments about how lucky the baby would be to have such a caring grandmother. Every interaction was calculated to make Carol feel important and needed. Meanwhile, every time Whitney looked at me when Carol wasn't watching, her expression was completely different. Cold, calculating, satisfied. She was enjoying this. That evening, after Carol had gone to bed, I confronted Whitney in the living room where she was watching television on our couch, like she owned the place. I heard your phone call this morning, I said quietly. Whitney didn't even flinch. She muted the television and looked at me with complete indifference. Did you? And what exactly do you think you heard? You telling Derek that you've been planning this move for months, that you've been manipulating my mother. She laughed, actually laughed. Prove it. It's your word against mine, and frankly, Carol already thinks you're jealous and immature. How do you think she'll react if you start making accusations about her beloved pregnant niece? I realized she was right. Carol was so invested in this narrative of Whitney being the sweet, helpless relative and me being the selfish daughter that she would never believe the truth. Besides, Whitney continued, I'm not doing anything wrong. I am pregnant, I do need support, and Carol is happy to provide it. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should consider finding your own place. After all, you're 22. Time to grow up. She unmuted the television and went back to her show, dismissing me completely. I stood there for several minutes realizing that my entire life had been upended by someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to remove. As I lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Whitney moving around in my room upstairs, I began to understand that this was not a temporary arrangement. This was a hostile takeover, and I was losing badly. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a moving truck parked in our driveway, and my heart sank to my stomach. 2 men in blue coveralls were carefully maneuvering something large and precious out of our front door. As they turned it toward the sunlight, I realized what it was and broke into a run. Stop, wait, that's my piano. The movers looked confused and checked their clipboard. Sorry, miss, but we have authorization to pick up this baby grand. Paid in full. I rushed into the house calling for Carol. Mom, what's happening? Why are they taking Dad's piano? I found her in the kitchen calmly washing dishes as if nothing unusual was occurring. She didn't even look up when I burst through the door. Oh, that old thing Whitney needed money for a proper crib and changing table. The piano was just taking up space in the living room anyway. Taking up space. My voice cracked. That was Dad's piano. He saved for 2 years to buy that for me when I started lessons. He said music would always be my sanctuary. Carol finally turned around, but her expression was cold and impatient. Ruthie, your father has been gone for 6 years. That piano has been collecting dust. Whitney's baby needs furniture, and we needed to make some practical decisions. You sold my father's piano without even telling me. I sold a piece of furniture that was in my house to help a family member in need. Stop being so dramatic. Whitney appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment wearing one of my favorite necklaces. The delicate silver chain with a small pearl pendant that my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday now hung around Whitney's neck like she had every right to wear it. Ruthie, I hope you don't mind that I borrowed this. It goes so well with maternity clothes, and I wanted to feel pretty for my doctor's appointment today. That's not yours to borrow, I said, my voice barely controlled. Oh, come on, don't be selfish. It's just sitting in your jewelry box anyway. Besides, pregnant women deserve to feel beautiful. Carol nodded in agreement. Whitney's right. You should be more generous with your things. Family shares. I looked around the kitchen and noticed other changes I had missed in my initial panic about the piano. My father's military photographs were gone from their usual spot on the windowsill. The small American flag display case with his Purple Heart medal was nowhere to be seen. Where are Dad's pictures, his medals? Whitney shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Carol. Oh, those. I asked Carol if we could put them away for now. They made me feel uncomfortable. All that military imagery around where I'm trying to create a peaceful environment for the baby. You found my father's Purple Heart uncomfortable. Well, yes, I don't really believe in glorifying violence, and I thought it would be better for the baby to be surrounded by more positive energy. Carol jumped to Whitney's defense immediately. She's right, Ruthie. We need to think about the baby's emotional development. Those military reminders were probably too intense for a nursery environment. I felt like I was losing my mind. My father had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been injured by an improvised explosive device while helping to build a school for children. His Purple Heart represented sacrifice, courage, and service to others. And now it was hidden away because it made my manipulative cousin uncomfortable. Dad was a hero. Those pictures and medals honor his memory. And they'll still honor his memory from the closet, Carol replied dismissively. This isn't about your father, Ruthie. This is about you refusing to accept that other people have needs too. I walked out to the front yard where the movers were securing my piano in their truck. The baby grand that had been my refuge during my parents' divorce, during Dad's illness, during every difficult moment of my adolescence, was being driven away to some stranger's house. Mrs. Henderson from next door was standing in her garden watching the scene with obvious concern. She had known our family for 15 years and had heard me practice piano countless times over the years. Ruthie dear, is everything all right? I saw them taking your beautiful piano. Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson, just some family changes. But her worried expression told me she could see that everything was definitely not fine. As the moving truck disappeared down our street, I realized that Whitney wasn't just taking over my room or my mother's attention. She was systematically erasing my presence from the house, removing the things that connected me to my father's memory and my own identity. That evening, our neighbor Harold knocked on the door. He was a retired veteran himself and had always respected my father's service. Carol answered, and I could hear their conversation from the living room. Carol, I couldn't help but notice they took away Tom's piano today. Is Ruthie all right? That instrument meant a lot to her. Harold, we're going through some family transitions right now. Ruthie needs to learn that she can't hold on to the past forever. Whitney's baby is our future, and we're making room for new memories. But that piano was Tom's gift to his daughter. It seems like something worth preserving. Harold, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. Ruthie is 22 years old. It's time she stopped clinging to childhood possessions and started thinking about real adult responsibilities. I heard Harold's hesitant voice. Of course, Carol. I just wanted to make sure everyone was doing well. Tom was a good man, and that piano represented something special. Tom is gone, Harold. The piano is gone. We're moving forward. When Harold left, I went upstairs to get some clothes from what used to be my room. Whitney was sitting on my old bed painting her toenails with my expensive nail polish, surrounded by shopping bags from high-end maternity stores. Nice color, she said, holding up the bottle. I hope you don't mind that I use the last of it. Pregnancy makes your nails grow so fast. I looked at the shopping bags, recognizing labels from stores that cost more than I made in a week. How did you afford all those clothes? Oh, Carol gave me some money to get proper maternity wear. She's so thoughtful. She said a pregnant woman shouldn't have to worry about looking nice. Something about the way she said it made me suspicious. How much money? Whitney's smile became slightly sharper. Enough to make sure the baby and I have everything we need. Carol understands that this is an investment in the family's future. That night, I lay on the living room couch again, staring at the empty space where my piano had sat for 16 years. The silence in that corner of the room felt like a physical wound. I thought about all the evenings I had played Bach and Chopin while doing homework, all the times music had helped me process my emotions. But what hurt even more was realizing that Carol had made this decision without any consideration of what the piano meant to me. She had reduced my father's thoughtful gift, my years of lessons, and practiced my emotional connection to music down to taking up space for Whitney's convenience. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about accommodating a pregnant relative. This was about Carol choosing Whitney over me in every possible way, and Whitney was smart enough to make sure every choice felt justified and necessary. As I drifted off to an uncomfortable sleep on the couch, I could hear Whitney moving around upstairs in my room, probably going through more of my belongings and deciding what else needed to be removed to make space for her new life in my old home. The next week brought a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about my financial security. I had been planning to check my college savings account to see how much money I had left for graduate school applications, but something Whitney had said about Carol providing money for her shopping spree was bothering me. I drove to the bank during my lunch break expecting to see the familiar balance of around $12,000 that I had been carefully building since high school. The account represented years of birthday money, summer job earnings, and careful saving with my father's encouragement. He'd always told me that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from me. The teller's expression changed when she looked at my account balance on her screen. "Miss Williams, I show a current balance of $347.18. My stomach dropped. That can't be right. There should be over $12,000 in that account. She pulled up the transaction history and turned the screen toward me. 3 large withdrawals had been made over the past month, all signed by Carol Williams as the account co-signer. The withdrawal slips listed the reason as family medical expenses. These withdrawals, I pointed to the screen with a shaking finger. I didn't authorize these. The co-signer on this account has full withdrawal privileges, the teller explained gently. These appear to be legitimate transactions. I asked for printed copies of all the transactions and drove home immediately, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Family medical expenses. I thought about Whitney's expensive maternity clothes, the premium prenatal vitamins I had seen in our kitchen cabinet, the designer diaper bag she had been carrying around. I found Carol in the backyard hanging baby clothes on the line to dry, tiny expensive outfits that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Mom, we need to talk about my savings account." Carol's face immediately became defensive. "What about it?" "You withdrew almost $12,000 from my college fund. The bank said it was for medical expenses." "Whitney needs proper prenatal care, Ruthie. She's carrying our family's future. I couldn't let her go to some cheap clinic when she needs the best doctors. That money was for my graduate school tuition. And Whitney's baby's health is more important than your advanced degree. You already have a bachelor's degree and a job. Whitney needs help right now." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "You stole my college savings." "I didn't steal anything. I'm the co-signer on that account, and I used family resources to help family. That's what real families do, Ruthie. They support each other." "Where exactly did this money go?" Carol's hesitation told me she hadn't expected me to ask for specifics. "Whitney's been going to Dr. Morrison's practice downtown. He's one of the best obstetricians in the city. She's also needed specialized testing because of her family history." I knew Dr. Morrison's practice. It was the most expensive medical office in our area, catering to wealthy clients who wanted luxury treatment alongside their health care. I also knew that Whitney had perfectly good insurance through Derek's construction company. "Mom, Whitney has insurance. Why would she need thousands of dollars for medical care?" "Insurance doesn't cover everything, Ruthie. Premium care costs extra money, and Whitney deserves the best. She's giving us a grandchild." That evening, I noticed Whitney wearing a different expensive outfit every day. When I looked in the closet of what used to be my room, I found designer maternity clothes with tags still attached some items she had never even worn. I did a quick mental calculation and realized the clothing alone represented at least $3,000. I confronted Whitney when Carol was taking a shower. "You used my college money to buy a designer wardrobe." "I used family money to buy appropriate maternity clothes," she corrected calmly. Carol wanted to make sure I felt confident and comfortable during my pregnancy. She said it was important for the baby's emotional development. Emotional development. Stressed mothers have stressed babies, Ruthie. Carol understands that investing in my well-being is investing in the baby's future. Besides, you can always go to graduate school later. This baby is only going to be born once. I realized that Whitney had convinced Carol that every expense, no matter how frivolous, was somehow essential for the baby's welfare. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and effective. Over the next few days, I watched Carol cater to Whitney's every whim. Whitney mentioned wanting organic groceries, so Carol started shopping at the most expensive health food store in town. Whitney said she needed a special pregnancy pillow, so Carol bought a $200 ergonomic support system. Whitney complained about the bathroom lighting being too harsh for her sensitive pregnancy skin, so Carol had an electrician install softer fixtures. Every request was framed as necessary for the baby's health, and every expense came from household funds that had previously been carefully budgeted. Carol was spending money we didn't have to accommodate Whitney's increasingly expensive tastes. The final straw came when I discovered that Whitney had convinced Carol to upgrade our cable package and internet service because the baby would need educational programming and high-speed connectivity for development. The monthly bill had tripled. When I tried to discuss the financial burden with Carol, she became angry and defensive. "You're being selfish and short-sighted, Ruthie. Whitney's baby is the most important thing happening in this family right now. If you can't support that, maybe you should consider whether you belong here." That night, I called my college friend Madison to talk through what was happening. Madison had met Whitney a few times at family gatherings and had never liked her. "Ruthie, this is financial abuse," Madison said bluntly. "Whitney is systematically draining your family's resources and manipulating your mother into funding her lifestyle. You need to protect whatever money you have left." "But she's pregnant and says she needs help." "Pregnant women need prenatal care and basic necessities. They don't need $1,000 wardrobes and luxury medical treatments. Whitney is taking advantage of your mother's emotions to fund a lifestyle she couldn't otherwise afford." After talking to Madison, I went online and researched the cost of standard prenatal care in our area. Even without insurance, Whitney's medical expenses should have been a few $100s, not several thousand. I also looked up Dr. Morrison's practice and discovered that he specialized in luxury maternity experiences for wealthy clients, including services like professional maternity photography sessions and spa treatments. Whitney wasn't just using my college money for medical care. She was using it for an expensive, indulgent pregnancy experience, while I lost my chance at graduate school. The next morning, Whitney was sitting in the kitchen eating expensive organic granola while browsing baby furniture catalogs. When she saw me, she smiled with satisfaction. "Carol and I were looking at cribs yesterday. We found the perfect one, but it's a little pricey. Don't worry, though. Carol said education money can always be earned back, but the perfect nursery is a once-in-a-lifetime investment." As I watched Whitney casually flip through catalogs of $1,000 furniture paid for with my carefully saved money, I realized that she had successfully convinced Carol to prioritize Whitney's wants over my needs, my father's memory, and our family's financial stability. And the most painful part was that Carol genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. 2 weeks later, Whitney made an announcement that shattered what was left of my emotional stability. I was in the kitchen making dinner when she came downstairs glowing with excitement and carrying a baby name book. "I've made a decision about the baby's name," she announced to Carol, who immediately stopped what she was doing to pay attention. "Oh, how wonderful. What have you chosen?" Whitney placed her hand on her growing belly and smiled. "I want to name him Thomas after Uncle Thomas. I think it would be a beautiful way to honor family history and connect the baby to his roots." Carol's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Oh, Whitney, that's the most thoughtful thing I've ever heard. Thomas would be so honored to have his great-nephew carry on his name." I stood frozen at the stove, the wooden spoon in my hand, dripping sauce onto the floor. Thomas was my father's name. My father, who had died 6 years ago from complications related to his military injuries. My father, whose piano Whitney had convinced Carol to sell. My father, whose medals and photographs were hidden in a closet because they made Whitney uncomfortable. "You want to name the baby after my dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Well, he's going to be my baby, and Thomas was my uncle, too, Whitney replied with false sweetness. I think it's important for children to have strong family connections. Besides, you've never had kids, so the name doesn't really matter to you personally. The casual cruelty of her statement hit me like a physical blow. She was taking my father's name just like she had taken his piano and his medals, and she was doing it while suggesting that my connection to him was somehow less meaningful than hers. Whitney, that's incredibly thoughtful, Carol gushed. And you're right, Ruthie doesn't have children, so it makes perfect sense for your son to carry on the family name. Actually, Whitney continued, I was thinking about this more, and I realized that the baby should have some physical connection to Uncle Thomas, too. Carol, do you still have his military dog tags? I thought they would make a beautiful necklace for me to wear during the rest of my pregnancy. You know, to keep Uncle Thomas's spirit close to the baby. Carol nodded enthusiastically. What a wonderful idea. They're upstairs in my dresser. I'll get them right now. I watched my mother hurry upstairs to retrieve my father's dog tags so that Whitney could wear them as a pregnancy accessory. The metal tags that had identified him during 3 tours of duty that had been with him when he was injured that represented his service and sacrifice were about to become a fashion statement for a woman who had found his Purple Heart medal too uncomfortable to display. When Carol returned with the dog tags, Whitney immediately put them on and admired herself in the mirror. Perfect. Now Thomas will be part of this whole journey. I can feel his presence already. This is so beautiful, Carol said, wiping away tears. Whitney, you have such a pure heart. The way you honor family is exactly what this house has been missing. I realized that Whitney had spent weeks researching my father's life, learning details about his service and his death not out of respect or genuine interest, but to find ways to manipulate our emotions and claim ownership of his memory. Mom, can I talk to you privately? I asked. Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Whitney. We're all family here. I don't think Whitney should name her baby after Dad. The kitchen fell silent. Carol's expression shifted from joy to anger faster than I had ever seen. Excuse me. Dad was my father. His name, his memory, those are important to me. Whitney barely knew him. Whitney immediately put on her hurt, vulnerable expression. Ruthie, I'm sorry you feel that way. I thought this would bring us closer as a family. I didn't realize you would be possessive about Uncle Thomas's memory. I'm not being possessive. I'm being protective of my father's legacy. Carol stepped between us, facing me with an expression of complete disappointment. Ruthie Williams, I am ashamed of you. Whitney is offering to honor your father's memory in the most beautiful way possible, and you're being petty and jealous. Your father would be heartbroken to see you acting this selfish. My father would be heartbroken to see his medals hidden in a closet and his piano sold to buy designer baby clothes. Whitney gasped dramatically and placed both hands on her belly. I can't handle this stress. This kind of negative energy isn't good for the baby. Carol immediately rushed to comfort Whitney. Don't worry, sweetheart. Ruthie is just having trouble adjusting to positive changes. She's always been resistant to sharing. I stood there watching my mother comfort the woman who had systematically destroyed my relationship with her, stolen my college savings, and was now claiming ownership of my father's name and identity. Whitney looked at me over Carol's shoulder with a satisfied smile. That evening, Whitney called Derek to share the baby name news, and I happened to overhear the conversation from the hallway. I know, isn't it perfect Carol is so emotional about the whole Uncle Thomas thing. She's completely invested now, and Ruthie looked like she was going to cry when I put on his dog tags. It's almost too easy. You're really naming the kid after her dead father. Derek's voice was audible through the phone speaker. It's brilliant, right? Carol will literally do anything for this baby now that she thinks he's carrying on her husband's legacy. She's already talking about setting up a college fund and changing her will to include provisions for little Thomas. I felt sick. Whitney wasn't honoring my father's memory. She was exploiting it for financial gain and emotional manipulation. She had researched his life, learned about his death, and crafted the perfect way to make Carol believe that supporting Whitney was the same as honoring Thomas. The next day I came home to find Whitney rearranging the living room furniture to accommodate a giant wooden rocking chair that she claimed was essential for bonding with baby Thomas. She was wearing my father's dog tags while directing Carol on the proper placement of her new furniture. "Ruthie, look what Whitney found for the nursery," Carol called out excitedly. "It's an antique rocking chair that's perfect for feeding little Thomas. It cost a bit more than we planned, but Whitney said she could feel Uncle Thomas's approval when she sat in it at the store." I looked at the price tag still attached to the chair. $800 for a piece of furniture that we absolutely did not need and could not afford. But Whitney had learned that invoking my father's name made any purchase seem justified and meaningful. As I watched Whitney rock in the expensive chair wearing my father's military identification and planning to give his name to her child, I realized that she had achieved something I hadn't thought possible. She had found a way to make my grief and my love for my father into weapons against me. Every time I objected to her behavior, I would look like someone who was dishonoring my father's memory. Every time I questioned her motives, she could claim I was being disrespectful to the baby who would carry his name. She had made my own father's legacy into a trap that prevented me from defending myself. That night, as I lay on the couch listening to Whitney moving around in my room upstairs, probably going through more of my belongings while wearing my father's dog tags, I finally understood that I was fighting a war I had no chance of winning. Whitney wasn't just taking over my physical space, she was rewriting the emotional narrative of our family with herself as the loving, grateful relative, and me as the selfish, ungrateful daughter who couldn't appreciate the honor being shown to her father's memory. And Carol believed every word of it. A week after the devastating baby name announcement, I was helping Carol sort through some of Whitney's belongings that had been left in boxes in the garage. Whitney had asked us to organize her extra things while she rested upstairs, claiming pregnancy fatigue. As I lifted a cardboard box labeled "Important Papers," the bottom gave way, spilling documents across the concrete floor. As I knelt to collect the scattered papers, my eyes caught something that made my heart race. Among the receipts and random mail was a lease agreement with Whitney's signature dated from 6 months ago. The address was for a luxury apartment complex downtown, and the monthly rent was listed as $2,400. I sat back on my heels staring at the document in disbelief. According to this lease, Whitney had been living in an expensive apartment with Derek for the past 6 months. She wasn't homeless. She hadn't been abandoned by her boyfriend. She had a stable living situation that cost more per month than most people's entire salary. I quickly gathered up the rest of the papers, my hands shaking as I discovered more evidence of Whitney's deception. There were utility bills for the apartment, grocery receipts showing expensive organic purchases, and even parking passes for a luxury car I had never seen her drive. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Benefits Documentation. Inside were applications for government assistance programs, food stamps, and emergency housing aid. Whitney had been claiming to be homeless and destitute while living in a luxury apartment and driving an expensive car. The application forms painted a picture of a desperate single pregnant woman with no support system and no income. She had listed Carol's address as her temporary emergency shelter and claimed that she was fleeing an abusive relationship with no financial resources. I photographed every document with my phone, my mind racing as I realized the scope of Whitney's fraud. She wasn't just manipulating our family for free room and board. She was committing federal crimes by claiming government benefits under false pretenses. Among the papers was also a receipt from an upscale consignment shop where Whitney had apparently sold several high-end baby shower gifts for cash. Items that well-meaning friends and family members had purchased for her baby were being converted into spending money while she collected government assistance for being impoverished. I heard footsteps approaching the garage and quickly shoved the papers back into a new box, keeping the photographed documents on my phone as evidence. Carol appeared in the doorway looking frustrated. "Whitney needs her heating pad for her back pain," she said. Have you seen it in any of these boxes? I haven't found a heating pad, but Mom, I think we need to talk about something important. What now? Ruthie Whitney isn't feeling well, and I don't have time for more of your complaints. I almost showed her the lease agreement right then, but something stopped me. Carol was so emotionally invested in Whitney's story that she might not believe the evidence even when confronted with it directly. I realized I needed to be more strategic. Nothing urgent, I said. I'll keep looking for the heating pad. That afternoon, while Whitney was at one of her expensive doctor appointments and Carol was at work, I decided to drive to the address on the lease agreement. I needed to see for myself what Whitney's real living situation looked like. The Riverside luxury apartments were exactly what I had expected from the monthly rent amount. The complex featured a gated entrance, manicured landscaping, a fitness center, and a sparkling swimming pool. This wasn't temporary emergency housing. This was upscale living that cost more per month than many families' entire household income. I parked across the street and watched as residents came and went. Everyone looked well-dressed and prosperous. Several luxury cars were parked in the covered parking area, including a black pickup truck that I recognized as Derek's vehicle. As I sat there, I saw Derek himself walk out of the building carrying a toolbox. He was clearly comfortable and familiar with the place, walking to his truck like someone who lived there permanently. This confirmed that Whitney's claims about Derek not being supportive were completely fabricated. I drove home with my head spinning, trying to process the magnitude of Whitney's deception. She wasn't just lying about her living situation. She was actively committing fraud by claiming government benefits while living a lifestyle that most honest working people couldn't afford. That evening, Whitney returned from her doctor's appointment with more expensive purchases. She had stopped at a boutique baby store and bought organic cotton onesies that cost $40 each. When Carol admired her purchases, Whitney sighed dramatically. The doctor said I need to focus on reducing stress and surrounding the baby with only the finest, most natural materials. He's concerned that synthetic fabrics might interfere with the baby's development. Carol nodded seriously. Of course. We want what's best for little Thomas. I watched this performance with new eyes, knowing that Whitney was funding her expensive tastes with government assistance meant for truly desperate women while living in luxury with her boyfriend. The level of calculated manipulation was breathtaking. Later that night, I overheard Whitney on the phone again, but this time I was prepared to record the conversation. Using my phone's voice memo app, I captured her talking to someone about her various benefit applications. The food stamp approval came through, so that's $300 a month for groceries, she said cheerfully. And the emergency housing assistance should kick in next week. They actually fast-tracked my application because I'm pregnant and supposedly homeless. The person on the other end of the call must have expressed concern because Whitney's tone became dismissive. Look, I pay taxes like everyone else. I'm just getting back what I'm entitled to. Besides, it's not like I'm going to need this stuff forever. Once the baby comes, Derek and I will figure out a more permanent arrangement. What about living with your aunt? That's just temporary until I can set up the perfect nursery situation. Carol's been incredibly helpful with funding everything. She's even talking about changing her will to make sure little Thomas is taken care of. I figure I can milk this family angle for at least another year or two. I felt sick listening to her casual discussion of milking my mother's emotions for financial gain. Whitney saw Carol's love and concern as resources to exploit, nothing more. The next day, I decided to research Whitney's benefit claims more thoroughly. I went to the library and used their computers to look up information about welfare fraud and the penalties involved. What I discovered was sobering. Whitney was committing multiple felonies that could result in serious jail time and substantial financial penalties. I also learned that there were hotlines for reporting suspected fraud and that false claims for government assistance were taken very seriously by both state and federal authorities. The documentation I had photographed would be more than enough evidence for an investigation. As I sat in the library surrounded by information about fraud prosecution, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could try to convince Carol of the truth, knowing she probably wouldn't believe me, or I could take the evidence to the proper authorities and let them handle Whitney's criminal behavior. But first I needed more evidence. If I was going to expose Whitney's lies, I needed to build an airtight case that would force even Carol to acknowledge the truth. That night, I lay on the couch making a mental inventory of everything I knew about Whitney's deception. The fake homelessness, the luxury apartment, the government fraud, the manipulation of Carol's emotions, the theft of my college savings. It was all connected in a web of lies that had allowed Whitney to live like a queen while presenting herself as a victim. Tomorrow I would start gathering more evidence. Whitney had underestimated me for the last time. The next Monday morning, I dressed carefully for work, choosing a professional outfit that would make a good impression for the quarterly review meeting I had been preparing for all month. I had developed a comprehensive marketing proposal that could potentially earn me a promotion, and I was feeling optimistic about my future, despite the chaos at home. I stopped at my favorite coffee shop on the way to the office, treating myself to an expensive latte as a small celebration before what I hoped would be a career-defining presentation. The morning was crisp and clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over at least one aspect of my life. That feeling lasted exactly until I walked through the front door of Morrison Marketing Group. Security was waiting for me at the elevator. 2 guards in navy blue uniforms approached me with serious expressions, and my stomach immediately dropped. "Miss Williams, we need you to come with us, please." "Is everything all right? I have a meeting at 9. "Ma'am, we just need you to collect your personal belongings and exit the building. HR will explain everything." I followed them to the elevator in complete confusion, my mind racing through possible explanations. Had there been some kind of security breach? Budget cuts, a company reorganization I hadn't heard about? The HR office was on the 3rd floor, and I had only been there once before during my initial hiring process 2 years ago. Jennifer Martinez, the HR director, was waiting for me with a concerned expression and a manila folder in her hands. "Ruthie, please sit down. I'm afraid we need to discuss the resignation call we received this morning." "What resignation call?" Jennifer opened the folder and pulled out a handwritten note. "At approximately 7:15 this morning, someone called claiming to be you and submitted your immediate resignation. The caller cited personal mental health issues and said you wouldn't be returning to the office." I stared at her in complete shock. "Jennifer, I never made that call. I'm here for my quarterly review meeting. I've been working on the Jameson Industries proposal for weeks." The caller knew specific details about your projects and your schedule. She mentioned the Jameson proposal specifically and said you were too emotionally unstable to handle the presentation. My blood ran cold. Well, the caller identified herself as you, but the voice did seem different than what I remembered. However, she had access to information that only you would know about your work assignments. I realized immediately what had happened. Whitney had been listening to my work phone calls and overhearing my conversations with Carol about my projects. She had gathered enough information to convincingly impersonate me and destroy my employment. "Jennifer, I never called in a resignation. Someone impersonated me. This is fraud." Jennifer's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Ruthie, I believe you, but this puts us in a very difficult legal position. The caller claimed to be having a mental health crisis and specifically requested that no one from the company contact you directly. She said any workplace contact could trigger a more serious episode." "This is insane. You can check my phone records. I never made this call." The call came from a blocked number, which the caller explained was for privacy reasons related to her mental health treatment. I sat there trying to process the sophistication of Whitney's sabotage. She hadn't just called in a random resignation. She had crafted a story that would make it difficult for my employer to verify the authenticity of the call, while simultaneously destroying my professional reputation. "What exactly did the caller say about my mental health?" Jennifer hesitated. "She claimed that you had been under severe stress due to family conflicts and had experienced several panic attacks at work. She mentioned that you had been talking to yourself and becoming increasingly paranoid about your coworkers." None of this was true, but I realized that Whitney had probably gathered these details from conversations I had had with Carol about work stress and family problems. She had twisted my legitimate concerns about her behavior into symptoms of mental illness. Jennifer, I need you to understand that someone is trying to sabotage my career. I can prove that I never made this call. Ruthie, I want to help you, but company policy requires us to take any mental health crisis seriously. If an employee calls and says they're unable to work due to psychological issues, we have to respect that and provide appropriate accommodations. What kind of accommodations? Well, typically, we would offer a leave of absence for mental health treatment, but since you submitted an immediate resignation, that's not possible. The caller specifically said you wanted to terminate employment rather than seek treatment through company resources. I realized that Whitney had trapped me perfectly. If I insisted I was mentally stable and wanted to return to work, it would look like I was in denial about my psychological problems. If I accepted the resignation, I would lose my job and my income, making me completely dependent on Carol for support. Jennifer, can I speak to my supervisor? Can we schedule a meeting to review what actually happened here? That's where this gets more complicated, Ruthie. The caller specifically said that any attempt by the company to contact you or pressure you to return to work could exacerbate your mental health issues. She threatened to pursue legal action if we didn't respect your boundaries. Whitney had anticipated every possible response. She had made it legally risky for the company to investigate the resignation or to offer me a chance to return to work. What about the Jameson presentation? I've been working on it for months. The caller mentioned that project specifically and said you were too unstable to complete it. We've reassigned it to Marcus Thompson from the senior team. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. The Jameson Industries proposal was my chance to prove I was ready for a senior marketing position. I had researched their company history, developed innovative campaign strategies, and prepared what I believed was the best work of my career. Now Marcus would present my ideas and probably get the promotion I had been working toward. Jennifer, please, check my work quality, my attendance record, my performance evaluations. Do I seem like someone who would have a mental health crisis? Ruthie, mental health issues can develop suddenly, especially under stress. The caller mentioned that you had been dealing with family conflicts and financial pressures that had been affecting your work performance. I realized that Whitney had used my own legitimate life stressors against me. The family conflicts she had created, the financial pressures resulting from her theft of my college savings, the stress of losing my living space, all of it became evidence supporting her fake mental health crisis story. What happens now? Unfortunately, because this was submitted as an immediate resignation rather than a medical leave, we have to process your termination today. Security needs to escort you out and will mail your final paycheck along with any documentation you need for unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits. Well, since this was a voluntary resignation for personal reasons, you may not be eligible for unemployment compensation. That's something you'll need to work out with the state agency. Whitney had destroyed not only my current employment, but also my financial safety net. By framing the resignation as voluntary and mental health related, she had made me ineligible for the unemployment benefits that could have helped me survive while looking for a new job. As security escorted me back to my desk to collect my personal belongings, I felt the stares of my coworkers. Word had already spread that I was having some kind of personal crisis. Marcus Thompson approached with fake sympathy. "Hey, Ruthie, I heard you're going through a tough time. Don't worry about the Jameson project. I'll take good care of it." I wanted to explain what had really happened, but I realized that anything I said would just sound like the paranoid delusions Whitney had described in her phone call. That afternoon, I drove home with a cardboard box of my desk belongings, completely unemployed, and with my professional reputation destroyed. When I walked into the house, Whitney was sitting in the living room reading pregnancy magazines with an expression of complete innocence. "Oh, Ruthie, you're home early. How was work?" "I don't have work anymore." Whitney's eyes widened with fake concern. "What happened? Did they lay you off?" "Someone called pretending to be me and resigned on my behalf, claiming I was having a mental health crisis." "That's terrible. Who would do such a thing?" Carol came into the room at that moment, having heard our conversation. "Ruthie, what's this about losing your job?" Someone impersonated me and called in a resignation claiming I was too mentally unstable to work. Carol looked immediately worried. Mental health problems, Ruthie, have you been feeling unstable? You've been acting strange lately with all your accusations and complaints. I watched Whitney's satisfied smile as Carol began to consider whether the fake resignation might actually have been legitimate. Whitney had planted just enough seeds of doubt about my behavior that Carol was ready to believe I might actually be having psychological problems. Mom, I'm not having a mental health crisis. Someone deliberately sabotaged my career. But who would know enough about your work to impersonate you convincingly? Whitney asked innocently. It was a perfect question. Anyone listening would assume that only someone very close to me could have gathered the necessary information, which would make them suspect that I had actually made the call myself during some kind of breakdown. That evening, as I sat on the couch reviewing my rapidly dwindling savings and trying to figure out how to survive without employment, I realized that Whitney had successfully isolated me from every support system I had built. I had no job, no income, no friends who believed me, and a mother who was beginning to question my sanity. But I still had the evidence I had gathered, and now I had even more motivation to use it. Over the next few days, I tried to reach out to friends for emotional support and job search advice, but I discovered that Whitney's sabotage extended far beyond my workplace. My friend Madison hadn't returned my calls for 3 days, which was unusual since we typically texted each other daily. When I finally reached her, her voice was strained and uncomfortable. Ruthie, I'm glad you called. I've been worried about you ever since your cousin reached out to me. My stomach dropped. Whitney called you. She's been calling several of your friends, actually. She said you've been having some kind of breakdown and that we should be aware of warning signs. She was really concerned about your mental state. Madison, what exactly did she tell you? Well, she said you've been having panic attacks and paranoid episodes. She mentioned that you've been accusing family members of stealing from you and making up elaborate conspiracy theories. She said your mom is really worried and considering getting you professional help. I closed my eyes, realizing how carefully Whitney had crafted her lies. Every concern I had shared with Carol about Whitney's behavior had been twisted into symptoms of mental illness and shared with my friends as evidence of my instability. Madison Whitney is lying. She's been manipulating my family and stealing money. I'm not having a breakdown. There was a long pause. Ruthie, I want to believe you, but Whitney provided some pretty specific examples of concerning behavior. She said you've been obsessing over your father's belongings and becoming irrationally angry when people try to move forward from his death. She's the one who sold my father's piano and hid his medals. I'm not obsessing. I'm defending his memory from someone who's exploiting it. See, that's exactly the kind of thing Whitney warned us about. She said you might become defensive and create elaborate explanations for your behavior. I realized that Whitney had trapped me in a perfect psychological prison. Any attempt to defend myself or explain the truth would be interpreted as further evidence of the mental health problems she had described. Madison, I need you to listen to me carefully. Whitney has been living in a luxury apartment while claiming to be homeless. She's committed welfare fraud and stolen my college savings. I have documentation proving everything. Ruthie Whitney showed us some of the threatening text messages you sent her. They were really intense and concerning. What text messages? The ones where you accused her of manipulation and threatened to expose her secrets. She was scared enough to screenshot them and share them with several people. I had never sent Whitney any threatening text messages. Every conversation we had been face-to-face or overheard phone calls, but I realized that Whitney could easily have created fake screenshots using my name and number. After hanging up with Madison, I tried calling my other close friends. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Whitney had contacted them, first sharing a story about my mental health crisis and providing evidence of my unstable behavior. She had poisoned every relationship I had by positioning herself as the concerned relative trying to help a disturbed family member. The most devastating call was to my boyfriend, Jake. We'd been dating for 8 months and I thought our relationship was strong enough to withstand this crisis. "Ruthie, I got a really disturbing call from your cousin yesterday," he said immediately when he answered the phone. "Jake, whatever she told you, it's not true. She said you've been having episodes where you lose touch with reality. She mentioned that you've been accusing her of crimes and becoming increasingly paranoid about everyone around you." "I'm not paranoid. I have evidence that she's been committing fraud and manipulating my family." "That's exactly what she said you would say. Look, Ruthie, I care about you, but I can't handle dating someone who's having serious mental health problems and won't admit it. I think we need to take a break until you get professional help." "Jake, please don't do this. Whitney is lying about everything." "Your cousin seemed genuinely worried about you. She even offered to help coordinate getting you into therapy. Why would she lie about something like that?" I tried to explain Whitney's motivations, but every word I said seemed to confirm Jake's belief that I was having paranoid delusions. He ended the relationship via text message later that day, citing my refusal to acknowledge my mental health needs as the reason. That evening, I discovered that Whitney's campaign extended to our neighbors as well. Harold, the retired veteran who had been concerned about my father's piano, approached me while I was checking the mailbox. "Ruthie, your cousin mentioned that you've been struggling with some personal issues. She wanted us to keep an eye out for any concerning behavior." "Harold, what did she tell you exactly?" "Well, she said you've been having trouble distinguishing between reality and imagination, particularly regarding your father's military service. She was worried that you might be developing some kind of trauma response related to his death." I felt physically ill. Whitney had taken my legitimate grief about my father's belongings being removed and reframed it as trauma-induced delusions. She had convinced our neighbors that my emotional attachment to his memory was actually a psychological disorder. She also mentioned that you might approach neighbors with wild stories about being victimized or persecuted. She asked us to listen sympathetically, but not to encourage what she called your fantasy narratives. Whitney had systematically destroyed my credibility with everyone in my life. Friends, boyfriend, neighbors, employer. She had reached out to each of them with a carefully crafted story that made me appear mentally unstable while positioning herself as the compassionate relative trying to manage a difficult situation. The most sophisticated part of her plan was that she had provided each person with specific examples of concerning behavior that they should watch for. Any attempt I made to expose her lies would be interpreted as exactly the kind of paranoid accusations she had warned them about. That night, I lay on the couch feeling completely isolated and defeated. Whitney had successfully cut me off from every source of external support and validation. No one would believe my accusations because she had preemptively discredited me as mentally unstable. But as I stared at the ceiling, I realized that Whitney had made one crucial mistake in her campaign of psychological warfare. She had been so focused on discrediting me to others that she had become overconfident about her own security. She still didn't know that I had evidence of her crimes. The next morning, while Whitney was at another expensive doctor's appointment, I decided to search through her belongings more thoroughly. If she was confident enough to destroy my social connections, she might have left additional evidence of her fraud scheme lying around. In a box labeled Personal Documents, I found something that made my heart race. Whitney had been keeping detailed notes about her manipulation strategy, apparently as a way to track her progress and plan future moves. The notebook contained entries like, "Called Ruthie's work friends again today. Emphasize the paranoid accusations and family conflict stress. Madison seems completely convinced now. Sent Jake screenshots of threatening messages. Used app to create fake text conversations. He's ready to break up with her. Carol is starting to question Ruthie's mental state. Need to push harder on the unstable behavior narrative. Maybe suggest therapy consultation?" Reading Whitney's handwritten plans for destroying my life was surreal. She had approached the psychological manipulation like a military campaign with specific targets and tactical strategies. But the most important discovery was a page titled Timeline for Moving Back to Apartment. Whitney had planned the entire fake pregnancy crisis as a temporary financial arrangement. She intended to return to her luxury apartment once she had extracted enough money from Carol and established herself as the primary beneficiary in any inheritance planning. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of hope. Whitney might have successfully isolated me from my support network, but she had also documented her own crimes in her own handwriting. This notebook would be crucial evidence when I finally decided to take action. As I photographed every page of the notebook, I realized that Whitney's arrogance would ultimately be her downfall. She had been so confident in her ability to manipulate everyone around her that she had never considered the possibility that someone might be gathering evidence against her. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of fighting back. The next day, while Whitney was enjoying her morning routine of expensive organic breakfast and prenatal vitamins, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being the victim in her carefully orchestrated scheme, and it was time to start gathering evidence that could actually hold up in court. I had been reactive for too long, simply documenting Whitney's lies without building a comprehensive case against her. But her notebook had shown me that she was operating with criminal intent, and I needed to approach this situation like the serious legal matter it had become. My first step was to upgrade my evidence-gathering technology. Using some of my remaining savings, I bought a high-quality voice recording app for my phone and a small digital recorder that I could hide in common areas of the house. If Whitney was going to continue making incriminating phone calls, I wanted to capture every word. That afternoon, while Carol was at work and Whitney was supposedly napping, I heard her on the phone in what used to be my room. The baby monitor Carol had installed to keep track of Whitney's well-being worked both ways, and I could clearly hear Whitney's conversation from the kitchen. I quickly activated my recording app and positioned myself where I could capture the conversation clearly. What I heard exceeded my worst expectations. "Derek, you should see how perfectly this is working out," Whitney was saying cheerfully. "Carol's like putty in my hands now. She actually thanked me yesterday for bringing purpose back to her life with the baby." Derek's voice was audible through the phone speaker. "How much longer are you planning to keep this up? My parents are starting to ask questions about when you're coming back to the apartment." "At least until after the baby's born, maybe longer if I can work it right. Carol's been talking about changing her will to make sure little Thomas is provided for. If I play this correctly, I could end up with half her estate." "What about Ruthie? Isn't she going to inherit everything?" Whitney laughed coldly. "Not if Carol believes she's mentally unstable. I've been documenting every conversation we have, making notes about her erratic behavior and concerning statements. If Ruthie tries to contest the will later, I'll have months of evidence about her psychological problems." My hands were trembling as I held the phone, but I forced myself to keep recording. This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed. "You're really going to frame her as crazy?" Derek sounded uncertain. "I'm not framing her as anything. I'm just highlighting existing patterns of behavior and helping Carol see them in the proper context. Ruthie's always been emotional and dramatic. I'm just helping people understand that those traits might indicate deeper psychological issues." "What about the government benefits? You're still collecting those, right?" "Of course. The food stamps alone save us $600 a month on groceries, and the emergency housing assistance is covering most of our actual rent. Why should I pay for things when the system is set up to help people like me?" "People like you?" "Pregnant women in need, Derek. I am pregnant and I do need financial assistance to ensure proper prenatal care. The fact that I have other resources available doesn't change the fact that government programs exist to support maternal health." Whitney had convinced herself that her fraud was justified because she was technically pregnant. She had rationalized stealing government benefits meant for truly desperate women by focusing on the one element of her story that was actually true. What about Ruthie's college money? What about it Carol made a decision to prioritize family medical expenses over her daughter's education? That's a perfectly reasonable parental choice. Besides, Ruthie can always go back to school later. This baby is only going to be born once. "You don't feel bad about any of this?" There was a long pause before Whitney answered. "Derek, I'm securing our financial future and ensuring that our child has every possible advantage in life. Ruthie is a grown adult who needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her. This whole situation is actually good for everyone involved. How is this good for Ruthie? She's learning independence and resilience. Sometimes people need to face challenges to grow as individuals. If Ruthie can't handle a little adversity, how is she ever going to succeed in the real world? Whitney had rationalized every aspect of her psychological and financial abuse as character-building exercises for my benefit. She genuinely believed that destroying my relationships, stealing my money, and sabotaging my career were somehow helping me become a stronger person. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes with Whitney detailing her plans for maximizing the financial benefits of her pregnancy while minimizing any real obligations to the family members she was exploiting. The key is maintaining the victim narrative, she explained to Derek. As long as Carol sees me as someone who needs protection and support, she'll continue prioritizing my needs over everything else. And as long as Ruthie appears unstable and selfish, Carol will feel justified in redirecting resources toward the baby's future. What if Ruthie figures out what you're doing? What if she does? Who's going to believe her? I've already established with everyone that she has a pattern of making paranoid accusations. If she starts claiming that I'm running some kind of elaborate con game, it'll just confirm what I've already told people about her mental health. This seems really risky, Whitney. The only risky thing would be not taking advantage of this opportunity. Carol is desperate to feel needed and important. Ruthie's emotionally vulnerable because of her father's death. I'm pregnant and need financial support. Everything I'm doing is just helping all these different needs come together in a way that benefits everyone. After the call ended, I sat in the kitchen reviewing my recording and planning my next move. Whitney's conversation had provided crucial evidence of criminal intent, psychological manipulation, and ongoing fraud. But I needed more than just her admissions. I needed documentation that would stand up in court. Over the next few days, I began building a comprehensive case file. I photographed Whitney's apartment lease, her government benefit applications, her expensive purchases funded by my college savings, and her handwritten manipulation notes. I documented the timeline of Carol's financial decisions and researched the legal penalties for welfare fraud in our state. I also began researching local attorneys who specialized in family financial abuse and government fraud cases. I needed professional legal advice about the best way to proceed without putting myself at further risk. Most importantly, I started looking into apartments I could afford with my limited remaining savings. If I was going to expose Whitney's crimes, I needed to be prepared for the possibility that Carol would choose to believe Whitney over me, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. My research revealed that welfare fraud cases were prosecuted aggressively in our state, especially when they involved substantial amounts of money. Whitney's benefit claims totaled several $1,000s, which put her scheme into felony territory, with potential prison time. I also discovered that there were whistleblower protections for people who reported government fraud, and that successful prosecutions often resulted in financial recovery for victims of related crimes. As I put together my evidence file, I realized that Whitney had made numerous crucial mistakes in her confidence. She had documented her own crimes, admitted to criminal intent over the phone, and created a paper trail that clearly demonstrated premeditation and ongoing deception. But most importantly, she had underestimated my intelligence and determination. Whitney had assumed that isolating me from my support network would leave me powerless to fight back. Instead, it had freed me from the obligation to protect her reputation and given me the motivation to pursue every available legal remedy. Tomorrow, I would begin making the phone calls that would bring Whitney's criminal empire crashing down around her. Early Monday morning, I drove to the public library to use their computers and phone system. I needed to make several important calls, and I didn't want any record of them on my personal phone or our home internet connection. Whitney had proven herself to be dangerously resourceful, and I wasn't taking any chances with operational security. My first call was to the state welfare fraud hotline. The representative who answered was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the nature of the suspected fraud and the evidence I had available. Ma'am, can you provide specific information about the false claims being made? The individual has been claiming homelessness and financial destitution while living in a luxury apartment with her boyfriend. She's collecting food stamps, emergency housing assistance, and pregnancy support benefits under completely false pretenses. Do you have documentation of her actual living situation? I have photographs of her apartment lease utility bills for the apartment and recordings of her discussing the fraud scheme with her boyfriend. There was a pause while the representative made notes. This sounds like it could constitute a serious case. Can you provide the individual's full name, social security number, if available, and the specific programs she's defrauding? I provided all of Whitney's information, including details about her government benefit applications and the approximate amounts she had been receiving. The representative explained that they would open an investigation within 48 hours and that I should be prepared to provide copies of all evidence. What happens during the investigation? Investigators will verify the individual's actual living situation, income, and family resources. If the evidence supports fraud charges, the case will be referred to the district attorney's office for prosecution. Fraudulent benefit claims can result in criminal charges, substantial fines, and requirement to repay all illegally obtained benefits. My second call was to the Child Protective Services reporting line. While Whitney's baby wasn't born yet, I felt obligated to report the unstable situation she was creating through her criminal behavior. The CPS worker was equally thorough in documenting my concerns. You're reporting that a pregnant woman is engaged in criminal fraud that could affect her ability to provide stable housing and care for her child. Exactly. She's been lying about her housing situation to obtain government benefits, and she's also been emotionally and financially abusing family members. I'm concerned about what kind of environment she'll provide for the baby. Do you have evidence that she's using drugs or alcohol during pregnancy? No, but I have evidence that she's committing multiple felonies and has no stable housing plan for after the baby is born. Her entire support system is based on lies and manipulation. The CPS worker explained that they would open a file and coordinate with the fraud investigators to monitor Whitney's situation throughout her pregnancy and after delivery. My third call was to a legal aid attorney who specialized in family financial abuse cases. Michael Thompson had excellent reviews online and offered free consultations for cases involving elder abuse and family fraud. Mr. Thompson, I need advice about recovering money that was stolen from my college savings account by a family member who's been manipulating my mother. Can you provide more details about how the money was taken and what kind of manipulation is occurring? I spent 20 minutes explaining Whitney's entire scheme, from her fake homelessness claims to her systematic isolation of me, from family support. Mr. Thompson took detailed notes and asked smart questions about the timeline and evidence. Ms. Williams, what you're describing constitutes several different types of criminal activity. The welfare fraud alone could result in felony charges, and the financial manipulation of your mother might qualify as elder abuse depending on her age and mental state. My mother is only 55, but Whitney has been using sophisticated psychological manipulation to control her decisions. That could still qualify as financial abuse, especially if we can demonstrate that your mother was making decisions under false pretenses. Do you have documentation of the withdrawal of your college funds? Complete bank records showing the withdrawals and recordings of Whitney discussing how she manipulated my mother into providing the money. Mr. Thompson was quiet for a moment. Miss Williams, you have an extremely strong case. I'd recommend that we coordinate with the criminal investigation while simultaneously pursuing civil recovery of your stolen funds. Whitney may face both criminal prosecution and civil liability. What are the chances of actually recovering the money? Given the evidence you've described, very good. Courts don't look favorably on people who commit fraud to fund luxury lifestyles, especially when the fraud involves government benefits and family exploitation. My final call was to the Department of Veterans Affairs. I wanted to report the theft and misuse of my father's military memorabilia, particularly his Purple Heart medal and dog tags. The VA representative was immediately concerned. Sir, the unauthorized possession and use of military medals is a federal crime, especially medals awarded for combat injuries. The individual has been wearing his dog tags as a fashion accessory and using his Purple Heart as nursery decoration, claiming she has the right because she's naming her baby after him. That is absolutely not legal. Military honors can only be possessed and displayed by the recipient or immediate family members with proper authorization. Using them as fashion accessories or home decoration is considered desecration of military honors. The VA representative connected me with their fraud investigation unit and explained that they would coordinate with local law enforcement to recover the stolen medals and pursue appropriate charges. We take this type of case very seriously, the investigator assured me. Military families have enough grief without having their loved ones' honors exploited by criminals. As I left the library that afternoon, I felt more empowered than I had in months. Whitney's criminal empire was about to face scrutiny from multiple government agencies simultaneously. Welfare fraud investigators, child protective services, legal authorities, and military fraud specialists would all be examining different aspects of her schemes. But most importantly, I had professional allies who understood the scope of Whitney's manipulation and took her crimes seriously. No longer was I a single voice trying to convince people who had been systematically turned against me. Now I had investigators with subpoena power and legal authority who would be examining objective evidence rather than Whitney's carefully crafted narratives. That evening, I began preparing my evidence files for submission to each investigating agency. I organized everything chronologically, created copies of all documents and recordings, and wrote detailed summaries explaining the connections between Whitney's various criminal activities. I also started secretly moving my most precious belongings to a storage unit across town. If Whitney's criminal prosecution proceeded as expected, there would probably be a period of chaos in our household, and I wanted to protect the few irreplaceable things I had left. The storage unit gave me another advantage, a secure mailing address where I could have important legal documents sent without Whitney intercepting them. I was learning to think like someone preparing for legal warfare rather than someone hoping for family reconciliation. As I packed boxes of my father's photographs, my childhood keepsakes, and my college records, I realized that I was finally taking control of my own life. Instead of reacting to Whitney's manipulation, I was building a systematic response that would hold her accountable for every lie, every theft, and every moment of psychological abuse. Whitney had taught me valuable lessons about strategic thinking and long-term planning. Unfortunately for her, I had been a very good student. Tomorrow the investigations would begin, and Whitney's perfect criminal scheme would start unraveling from every direction at once. 3 days later, while Carol was at her book club and Whitney was at another expensive spa appointment disguised as prenatal care, I executed the plan I had been preparing for weeks. I had spent the entire morning writing the most important letter of my life, carefully crafting every word to ensure maximum impact when Whitney and Carol discovered it. I started by loading my car with the essential belongings I had been quietly moving to storage over the past week. My father's remaining photographs, my college diplomas, my professional portfolio, and the few pieces of jewelry that Whitney hadn't already claimed were safely packed in boxes and suitcases. And the hardest part was leaving behind the room that had been my sanctuary for 22 years. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, now completely transformed into a luxury nursery, with expensive furniture bought using my college savings. Whitney had redecorated everything in expensive organic cottons and hand-painted details that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. But I wasn't sad anymore. I was determined. I placed my letter on the kitchen table where Carol would see it immediately when she returned from her evening out. Next to the letter, I arranged copies of every piece of evidence I had gathered. Whitney's apartment lease photographs of her luxury lifestyle bank records, showing the theft of my college funds, transcripts of her recorded conversations, and her own handwritten notes about manipulating our family. The letter itself was 5 pages long, typewritten and professionally formatted like a legal document. I had learned from Whitney that presentation mattered when trying to convince people of the truth. Dear Mom, it began. By the time you read this letter, I will have moved out of the house permanently. This decision was not made impulsively or in anger, but after weeks of careful consideration and investigation into what has been happening to our family. For the past 2 months, Whitney has been conducting an elaborate fraud scheme that has targeted both our household and multiple government assistance programs. I have discovered that she has never been homeless, never been abandoned by Derek, and never been in legitimate financial need. Instead, she has been living in a luxury apartment while claiming government benefits under false pretenses and manipulating you into funding her expensive lifestyle preferences. Whitney has stolen nearly $12,000 from my college savings account by convincing you that the money was needed for medical expenses. In reality, this money was used to purchase designer maternity clothes, luxury furnishings, and premium medical services that her own insurance would have covered. She has been committing welfare fraud by collecting food stamps and housing assistance while living in an apartment that costs $2,400 per month. I continued by detailing every aspect of Whitney's manipulation, providing specific dates, amounts, and corroborating evidence for each claim. I explained how she had systematically poisoned my relationships with friends, sabotaged my employment, and isolated me from family support. Whitney has been wearing Dad's Purple Heart medal and dog tags, not out of respect for his memory, but as props in her performance of the grieving family member who deserves special consideration. She researched his military service specifically to find ways to manipulate your emotions and justify her increasingly expensive demands. The decision to name her baby Thomas was not made to honor Dad's memory, but to ensure that you would feel emotionally invested in providing ongoing financial support for the child. Whitney has been planning to use the baby's name as leverage for inheritance planning and future financial manipulation. I have documented evidence that Whitney views you as a resource to exploit rather than a family member to love. Her recorded conversations with Derek reveal that she considers this entire situation to be a temporary financial arrangement designed to extract maximum benefit before returning to her real life. Mom, I love you, and I understand that Whitney has been very skilled at making her lies seem believable. She studied our family dynamics and crafted her story to appeal to your desire to feel needed and your natural compassion for people in crisis. None of this is your fault, but it needs to stop before she causes even more damage. I have reported Whitney's crimes to the appropriate authorities, and investigations are currently underway. You will likely be contacted by welfare fraud investigators, child protective services, and other agencies in the coming days. I encourage you to cooperate fully with these investigations and to consult with an attorney about recovering the money that was stolen from our family. I am not disappearing from your life, but I am removing myself from a situation where I have been consistently victimized and blamed for defending myself. When you are ready to acknowledge what has really been happening here, I will be available to rebuild our relationship on honest terms. The enclosed evidence speaks for itself. Whitney has been conducting a criminal enterprise designed to defraud both our family and government assistance programs. She has manipulated your love for Dad's memory, your excitement about becoming a grandmother, and your desire to help family members in need. I hope you will review this evidence with an open mind and consider whether the person you have been supporting is the same person you thought you knew. Whitney's greatest skill has been making her victims feel guilty for questioning her motives, but asking questions is not selfish or ungrateful. It's necessary. I am finally growing up, Mom. I'm learning to protect myself from people who would exploit my loyalty and kindness for their own benefit. I'm learning that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and honesty, not manipulation and exploitation. I hope that Whitney's baby will have the chance to grow up in an environment based on truth and genuine love, rather than the web of lies and manipulation that has characterized his mother's behavior toward our family. You can reach me at the phone number and address enclosed. I look forward to hearing from you when you're ready to discuss this situation honestly and consider what steps are needed to recover our family's financial and emotional stability. Love always, Ruthie. P.S. I have provided copies of all evidence to law enforcement agencies. Whitney's crimes will be investigated and prosecuted regardless of what happens within our family. This is no longer just a personal matter, but a legal one. I sealed the letter and evidence package in a large manila envelope and left it prominently displayed on the kitchen table. Next to it, I placed my house key and a note with my new address and phone number. My new apartment was small and modestly furnished, but it was mine. I had found a one-bedroom place across town that I could afford with my savings while I looked for new employment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was honest, and it was free from manipulation and psychological abuse. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. I was grieving the loss of the relationship I had thought I had with Carol, but I was also excited about the possibility of building a life based on my own values and decisions rather than someone else's manipulation. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their poor judgment. Carol needed to face the consequences of her choices without me serving as a convenient scapegoat for Whitney's behavior. My phone was turned off for the rest of the evening. Whatever chaos my departure and letter caused, I wanted Whitney and Carol to process it without being able to immediately contact me for damage control. They needed time to read the evidence and consider whether they were willing to acknowledge the truth about what had been happening. That night, I slept in my own bed in my own apartment, free from the sound of Whitney moving around in what used to be my room. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing that I had finally taken control of my own life and future. Tomorrow, the investigations would move forward, and Whitney would discover that her victims were not as powerless as she had believed. 48 hours after I left my letter and evidence package, my phone started ringing at 7:30 in the morning. The caller ID showed our home number, but I didn't answer. I had committed to giving Carol and Whitney time to process the information without immediate explanations or defenses from me. Instead, I spent the morning at my new apartment organizing my belongings and applying for jobs online. I had already contacted my former employer's HR department to clarify the circumstances of my resignation, and Jennifer had agreed to review the evidence of Whitney's impersonation fraud. At 10:15, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. This time I answered. Miss Williams. This is Angela Martinez from Child Protective Services. We're following up on your report regarding Whitney Patterson's pregnancy situation. I wanted to let you know that we've initiated an investigation and will be conducting interviews with the involved parties. What does that involve? We'll be visiting the residence where Miss Patterson claims to be living and interviewing your mother about the living arrangements and financial support being provided. We'll also be coordinating with the welfare fraud investigators to ensure we have a complete picture of Miss Patterson's actual circumstances. When will this happen? We're planning visits for this afternoon. Based on the evidence you provided, we have concerns about Miss Patterson's housing stability and her truthfulness about her support systems. If she's been lying about fundamental aspects of her situation, that raises questions about her ability to provide appropriate care for the baby. An hour later, I received another call, this time from David Thompson at the State Welfare Fraud Investigation Unit. Miss Williams, we've reviewed your evidence submission and I wanted to update you on our progress. We've verified that Miss Patterson has been collecting benefits under false pretenses for approximately 3 months. The total amount of fraudulent claims exceeds $15,000. $15,000. She's been receiving food stamps, emergency housing assistance, pregnancy nutrition support, and medical assistance. All of these programs require truthful reporting of income, housing, and family support, which Ms. Patterson has consistently falsified. What happens now? We're executing a joint investigation with CPS and local law enforcement today. We'll be interviewing all parties and documenting Ms. Patterson's actual living situation. If our investigation confirms fraud, she'll face criminal charges and immediate termination of all benefits. Will she have to pay the money back? Absolutely. Fraudulent benefit claims require full restitution plus penalties. She'll also face potential jail time depending on the total amount involved and her criminal history. At 12:30, Carol called. Her voice was strained and confused. "Ruthie, there are people here asking questions about Whitney's living situation. They're saying she might be committing fraud. Can you please come home and explain what's happening?" "Mom, did you read the letter and evidence I left?" "I read some kind of letter full of accusations, but I don't understand how you could make up such terrible stories about a pregnant family member." I realized that Carol was still in denial despite being presented with documentary evidence. "Mom, I didn't make up anything. Every claim in that letter is supported by documentation that you can verify independently." These investigators are saying Whitney has an apartment downtown that costs over $2,000 a month. That can't be true because she told me she was homeless. "It is true, Mom. I provided them with copies of her lease agreement and utility bills. Whitney has been lying to you about everything." There was a long silence. "Ruthie, if this is true, then I've made terrible mistakes. I've treated you horribly based on Whitney's lies. The investigators will help you understand what's been happening. Just answer their questions honestly and show them any financial records they request." That afternoon, Angela Martinez called me back with an update. "Miss Williams, we've completed our initial interviews and I wanted to share our findings. Miss Patterson's claims about homelessness and financial need appear to be completely fabricated." "What did you discover?" "We visited the apartment address from her lease, and the property manager confirmed she's been a resident for 8 months. Her boyfriend, Derek, was present and admitted that they've been living together while she collected benefits, claiming to be abandoned and homeless." How did Carol react to this information? "Your mother was shocked and upset. She had no idea that Miss Patterson had been lying about basic facts regarding her housing and relationship status. She's been very cooperative with our investigation and provided financial records showing the money she's provided for Miss Patterson's expenses." "What about Whitney?" Miss Patterson became defensive and tried to claim that her living arrangement was temporary and that she still qualified for assistance because she was emotionally homeless due to family stress. That's not a legal justification for benefit fraud. "Is she going to be arrested?" She's been issued a citation and will appear in court next week for arraignment on fraud charges. We've also opened a case file to monitor her situation through the remainder of her pregnancy and after the baby's birth. Later that evening, I received a call from Michael Thompson, the legal aid attorney I had consulted, about recovering my stolen college funds. "Miss Williams, I've been in contact with the investigating agencies about your case, and we're in a very strong position to recover the money that was taken from your savings account. The fraud investigation has confirmed that Miss Patterson used false pretenses to convince your mother to withdraw your college funds. Can we actually get the money back?" "Yes, we can pursue both criminal restitution through the fraud case and civil recovery through a separate lawsuit. Your mother was the victim of fraud just as much as you were, and courts routinely order full financial recovery in cases like this." "What about the money Whitney spent on clothes and furniture?" "We can force the sale of those assets to satisfy the restitution order. Miss Patterson won't be allowed to keep luxury items purchased with stolen money while owing restitution to her victims." That night, I finally felt like justice was beginning to unfold. Whitney's perfect criminal scheme was collapsing under official scrutiny, and the agencies with legal authority were taking her crimes seriously. More importantly, Carol was finally being forced to confront objective evidence rather than Whitney's manipulative stories. Government investigators don't get emotionally invested in family drama or fooled by fake tears and victim narratives. They focus on documents, timelines, and verifiable facts. For the first time since this nightmare began, Whitney was facing consequences that she couldn't manipulate her way out of. You can't charm your way out of federal fraud charges or convince Child Protective Services that criminal behavior is actually family loyalty. As I went to sleep in my own apartment, I realized that fighting back had been the right choice. Standing up to manipulation and abuse is never easy, but sometimes it's the only way to create space for truth and justice to prevail. The next morning brought a phone call that would mark the beginning of Whitney's complete downfall. Detective Sarah Morrison from the county sheriff's office called to inform me that Whitney had been formally charged with multiple felonies related to her fraud schemes. Miss Williams, I wanted to update you on the charges filed against Miss Patterson. She's been charged with welfare fraud in the first degree, which is a Class C felony, along with identity theft charges related to her impersonation of you at your workplace. Identity theft charges. When Miss Patterson called your employer and impersonated you to submit a false resignation, she committed identity fraud. Using someone else's identity to damage their employment constitutes a serious crime, especially when it results in financial harm to the victim. What kind of penalties is she facing? Welfare fraud in this amount range typically carries a sentence of 2 to 5 years, plus full restitution. The identity theft charges add another 1 to 3 years. She's looking at significant prison time if convicted. What about the money she stole from my family? Restitution is mandatory in fraud cases. She'll be required to repay every dollar she obtained through false pretenses, plus interest and penalties. We've also frozen her bank accounts, pending investigation of additional financial crimes. An hour later, I received a call that was even more satisfying. Carol's voice was shaky and filled with regret. Ruthie, I need to apologize to you. The investigators have shown me evidence that I couldn't ignore or explain away. Whitney has been lying to me about everything, and I've treated you terribly based on her manipulation. Mom, I'm glad you're beginning to see the truth. I'm more than seeing it, honey. I'm horrified by it. They showed me records of her apartment photographs of her living there with Derek and documents proving she's been collecting government assistance while living in luxury. I feel like such a fool. You're not a fool. Whitney is extremely skilled at manipulation. She studied our family and crafted her lies specifically to appeal to your emotions. But Ruthie, I took your college money. I sold your father's piano. I treated you like you were the problem when you were trying to protect me from being taken advantage of. I could hear Carol crying, and despite everything that had happened, my heart went out to her. Mom Whitney convinced you that helping her was the right thing to do. She made you believe that I was being selfish and that she was genuinely in need. The investigators told me she's been spending our money on designer clothes and luxury treatments while claiming to be desperate for basic necessities. They said some of her maternity outfits cost more than I make in a week. Whitney saw you as a resource to exploit Mom, but that says something about her character, not yours. There's something else, Ruthie. Derek came to the house this morning and broke up with Whitney. He said he can't risk his business reputation being associated with someone facing felony fraud charges. This was the development I had been hoping for but hadn't expected so quickly. Whitney's perfect life with Derek was crumbling just as fast as her criminal schemes. How did Whitney react to that? She's upstairs crying and making phone calls trying to find somewhere else to live. Derek told her she has to move out of their apartment by the end of the week because the lease is in his name and he won't risk being connected to her legal problems. So she's actually facing homelessness now. Yes, but this time it's real homelessness caused by her own criminal behavior, not the fake homelessness she claimed to justify stealing from our family. That afternoon, Angela Martinez from CPS called with another update. Miss Williams, there have been significant developments in Miss Patterson's case. Her boyfriend has ended their relationship and evicted her from their apartment due to her criminal charges. What does that mean for the baby? Miss Patterson now has genuine housing instability, no stable income since her benefits have been terminated, and she's facing significant legal expenses for criminal defense. She's also developed pregnancy-related health complications that appear to be stress-related. What kind of complications? Elevated blood pressure and early labor symptoms. Her obstetrician has recommended bed rest and stress reduction, but Miss Patterson's current situation makes that impossible. She's now genuinely facing the crisis she was previously claiming to experience falsely. Is the baby in danger? There are concerns. Miss Patterson's stress levels are extremely high due to her legal situation, and she has no stable support system. The family members she was exploiting are no longer willing to provide assistance, and her boyfriend has distanced himself from her completely. What happens if she can't provide stable housing for the baby? If Miss Patterson cannot demonstrate adequate housing, income, and support systems by the time the baby is born, we may need to consider temporary protective custody. Children cannot be placed in situations where their basic needs cannot be met. The irony was overwhelming. Whitney had spent months claiming to need help preparing for her baby, when in reality she had been perfectly capable of caring for herself. Now, because of her criminal behavior, she was facing the genuine crisis she had previously fabricated for sympathy and financial gain. That evening, my phone rang with a call from Derek himself. I had never spoken to him directly, but his voice was tired and apologetic. "Ruthie, this is Derek, Whitney's ex-boyfriend. I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened to your family. I knew Whitney was manipulating your mother, but I didn't realize she was committing serious crimes. Did you know about the welfare fraud? I knew she was getting government assistance, but she told me it was temporary and that she qualified because of pregnancy complications. I didn't know she was lying about our living situation or her income level. What changed your mind about supporting her?" When the investigators showed up at our apartment, I realized how serious this was. Whitney has been lying to everyone, including me. I can't build a life with someone who solves problems through fraud and manipulation. "What about the baby?" Derek was quiet for a long moment. "I love that baby, but I can't raise a child with someone who might go to prison for felony crimes. My parents have offered to help with custody arrangements if Whitney is unable to provide proper care." "Your parents want custody. They want to make sure their grandchild has a stable, honest home. If Whitney goes to prison, they're prepared to file for guardianship to protect the baby from the chaos she's created." As I ended the call with Derek, I realized that Whitney had succeeded in destroying every relationship and support system she had. Her manipulation and criminal behavior had cost her not only her freedom and financial security, but also her relationship with the father of her child. The baby she had claimed to be protecting through her elaborate fraud schemes was now at risk precisely because of those same schemes. Whitney had become the danger to her own child's welfare that she had falsely claimed others to be. For someone who had been so skilled at manipulating other people's emotions and vulnerabilities, Whitney had been remarkably blind to the long-term consequences of her own choices. She had traded short-term financial gain for the complete destruction of her future stability and relationships. Justice wasn't just being served through the legal system. It was unfolding naturally as Whitney's victims withdrew their support and her enabling systems collapsed under the weight of truth. 3 weeks after Whitney's arrest, I received a phone call that marked the beginning of my own recovery. Jennifer Martinez from my former employer was calling with unexpected news. "Ruthie, I wanted to personally apologize for the way your resignation was handled. After reviewing the evidence of impersonation fraud, we've determined that you were the victim of a serious crime, and we'd like to offer you reinstatement." Reinstatement. "We're prepared to offer you a senior marketing position with a salary increase and full benefits. Your work on the Jameson Industries proposal was exceptional, and we realize that your departure was the result of criminal sabotage rather than any performance issues." "What about Marcus Thompson's presentation of my work?" "Marcus presented your proposal as scheduled, and it was very well received. However, when we learned that the ideas were originally yours and that you had been forced out through fraud, we felt it was important to correct the injustice. Marcus has been reassigned, and you would be taking over the account directly." I sat down heavily in my apartment, overwhelmed by this unexpected development. "Jennifer, I thought I had been blacklisted because of the mental health claims Whitney made." "Quite the opposite. Once we understood what had actually happened, your situation became a cautionary tale about employment fraud that we're using in our security training. You're seen as someone who was victimized by sophisticated criminal behavior, not someone with performance problems. When would I be able to start? Immediately, if you're interested. We've prepared a formal letter of reinstatement that clarifies the circumstances of your departure and restores your professional reputation. We're also prepared to assist with any legal proceedings related to the identity theft charges. That afternoon, I had another positive phone call, this time from Michael Thompson, about the recovery of my college savings. Ruthie, we've reached a preliminary agreement on full restitution of your college funds. The criminal case has provided leverage for civil recovery, and Whitney's assets are being liquidated to satisfy the debt. She actually has assets to liquidate. Her designer clothing collection is worth several $1,000s, and she had accumulated expensive electronics and jewelry using your stolen money. Everything purchased with fraudulent funds is subject to seizure and sale. What about the money she spent on medical treatments and services? We can pursue recovery from the medical providers who were overpaid using fraudulent insurance claims. Whitney was essentially double-dipping by using both legitimate insurance and your mother's money for the same services. How long will the recovery process take? With the criminal conviction pending, we should have your funds restored within 60 days. You'll also receive interest and compensation for the educational opportunities you lost due to the theft. This is really going to work? Absolutely. Courts take financial exploitation very seriously, especially when it involves educational funds and family manipulation. Whitney will be paying restitution for years to come. That evening, Carol called with news that was both heartbreaking and vindicating. Her voice was tired but determined. Ruthie, I need to tell you what's been happening here. Whitney gave birth yesterday, but there were serious complications. What kind of complications? Her blood pressure spiked during labor, and she had to have an emergency cesarean section. The stress from her legal situation and housing instability contributed to pregnancy-related health problems. Is the baby okay? Little Thomas is healthy, but Whitney is facing significant medical bills that she can't pay. Her insurance was canceled when they discovered she had been fraudulently claiming benefits, and she owes thousands of dollars for the delivery. Where is she living now? She's been staying in a motel across town, but she can't afford to continue paying for the room. Child Protective Services has determined that a motel is not suitable housing for a newborn, especially with Whitney's legal and financial situation. What does that mean? They're requiring her to find stable housing within 72 hours, or they'll place the baby in temporary protective custody. Derek's parents have offered to take Thomas if Whitney can't provide appropriate care. I felt a complex mixture of emotions hearing this news. While I was glad that justice was being served, I also felt sad for the innocent baby who was suffering because of his mother's criminal choices. How is Whitney handling all of this? She's finally understanding the consequences of what she did to our family. She asked me to call you and ask if there's any way you could forgive her and help her with the baby. What did you tell her? I told her that forgiveness is something that develops over time, but that help is something you earn through changed behavior. She destroyed your trust and stole your future, and she can't expect you to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. I'm proud of you for saying that, Mom. I've learned some hard lessons about enabling bad behavior. Whitney is facing exactly the situation she claimed to be in originally, but this time it's real, and it's caused by her own criminal actions. The baby deserves better than a mother who solves problems through lies and manipulation. What are you going to do about the baby? I've been in contact with Derek's parents, and they seem like good, honest people who want to provide Thomas with a stable home. If Whitney can't demonstrate that she's capable of providing proper care, I'll support their custody petition. The next day, I received a letter that provided the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the scope of Whitney's manipulation. It was from the Veterans Affairs Investigation Unit, informing me that they had recovered my father's Purple Heart medal and dog tags. Miss Williams, we have successfully recovered the military honors belonging to your father, Staff Sergeant Thomas Williams. The individual who was unlawfully possessing these medals has relinquished them as part of a plea agreement to avoid federal prosecution for desecration of military honors. The letter went on to explain that Whitney had agreed to return all of my father's military memorabilia and to pay a fine for their misuse, rather than face additional federal charges that would have increased her potential prison sentence. When I held my father's Purple Heart again for the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure that went beyond simple recovery of stolen property. Whitney had tried to use my father's memory and sacrifice as tools for manipulation, but in the end his honor had been restored, and her dishonor had been exposed. That afternoon I drove to my father's grave for the first time since Whitney had begun her campaign against our family. I placed fresh flowers on his headstone and told him about everything that had happened. Dad, I stood up for your memory and your values. I didn't let someone exploit your sacrifice for their own selfish purposes. I think you would be proud of how I fought back when it mattered. As I drove home to my own apartment with my father's medals safely returned and my career restored, I realized that Whitney's greatest failure had been underestimating the strength that comes from fighting for truth and justice. She had assumed that manipulation and psychological warfare would always triumph over honesty and determination. Instead, her criminal behavior had awakened something in me that I hadn't known I possessed the courage to stand up to abuse and the wisdom to seek justice through proper channels rather than trying to fight manipulation with more manipulation. Whitney had intended to destroy my life, but instead she had taught me how strong I really was. 6 weeks after Whitney gave birth to Thomas, the final pieces of justice fell into place, with devastating consequences for her criminal schemes. I was at my restored job working on the Jameson Industries expansion project when Angela Martinez called with news that would change everything. Miss Williams, I wanted to update you on the custody determination for Whitney Patterson's baby. The court has made its final decision based on our investigation and Miss Patterson's current circumstances. What did they decide? Miss Patterson has lost custody of her son. The judge determined that her pattern of criminal behavior, lack of stable housing, and inability to provide financially for the baby's needs make her unsuitable for primary custody at this time. I sat down slowly in my office chair, absorbing the magnitude of this development. Where will Thomas go? Derek's parents, Richard and Susan Miller, have been granted temporary guardianship with the option for permanent adoption if Miss Patterson cannot demonstrate rehabilitation within 12 months. They have stable income, appropriate housing, and genuine concern for the child's welfare. How did Whitney react to losing custody? She was devastated but not entirely surprised. Her attorney had warned her that her criminal conviction and housing instability made custody retention very unlikely. The judge was particularly concerned about her pattern of manipulation and fraud, which suggests poor judgment and character. What does she have to do to potentially regain custody? Complete her prison sentence, pay full restitution to her victims, maintain stable housing and employment for at least 6 months, and undergo psychological evaluation to address her manipulative behavior patterns. Even then, she would need to prove that reunification would serve the child's best interests. That afternoon, I received a call from Carol with additional details about Whitney's sentencing hearing, which had taken place that morning. Ruthie Whitney was sentenced to 3 years in state prison for the fraud charges, plus 2 additional years of supervised probation. She has to pay back every penny she stole from government programs and from our family. How much does she owe in total? Over $35,000 when you include the government benefits, your college money, the medical bills she paid with fraudulent claims, and the court fees and penalties. The judge said her crimes were particularly serious because she exploited both family relationships and public assistance programs. Will she actually serve the full 3 years? Her attorney said she might be eligible for parole after 18 months if she demonstrates good behavior and makes progress on restitution payments. But she'll be monitored closely, and any violation of her probation terms will result in additional prison time. How is she handling the reality of losing everything? Carol was quiet for a moment. She's finally understanding what she did to herself and to everyone around her. The woman who was so confident about manipulating everyone is now facing the consequences of destroying every relationship and support system she had. Does she have anywhere to go when she gets out of prison? Derek's parents have offered to maintain supervised contact so she can potentially have a relationship with Thomas, but only if she completes rehabilitation programs and proves she's changed her behavior. Nobody else in the family wants to risk being manipulated again. That evening, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address showed that it came from the county jail where Whitney was being held pending transfer to state prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. The letter was handwritten on standard jail stationery, and Whitney's usually confident handwriting looked shaky and uncertain. Dear Ruthie, it began, I know I have no right to ask for your time or attention after what I did to you and your family. I'm writing this letter not because I expect forgiveness, but because I need to acknowledge the truth about my behavior and its consequences. You were right about everything. I was never homeless, never abandoned by Derek, and never in legitimate financial need. I planned the entire scheme to exploit your mother's emotions and your family's resources for my own benefit. I researched your father's military service specifically to find ways to manipulate Carol's grief and your attachment to his memory. I convinced myself that I deserved the money and support I was stealing because I was pregnant and wanted the best possible life for my baby. I told myself that your family could afford to help me and that my lies were justified by my need to provide for Thomas. But I was wrong about everything. By lying and stealing and manipulating people who cared about me, I destroyed my own ability to provide a stable life for my son. The criminal behavior I thought would secure Thomas's future has cost him his mother and left him in the care of people who are essentially strangers. I sabotaged your job because I was jealous of your independence and success. I poisoned your relationships with friends because I wanted you to be isolated and dependent on family support that I was controlling. I stole your father's medals because I wanted to claim ownership of your family's emotional history. None of these actions were justified by my pregnancy or my desire to help my baby. They were selfish crimes that hurt innocent people who had never done anything to deserve being victimized. The letter continued for 2 more pages with Whitney detailing specific aspects of her manipulation and acknowledging the harm she had caused. She didn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses. Instead, she provided a clear confession of her criminal intent and emotional abuse. The hardest part of facing the truth is realizing that I became exactly the kind of person I used to criticize. I was the manipulative family member who exploits other people's kindness. I was the welfare fraud who takes resources away from people who genuinely need help. I was the criminal who justifies illegal behavior by focusing on my own wants rather than other people's rights. Thomas deserves better than a mother who solves problems through lies and theft. Derek deserves better than a girlfriend who commits crimes that threaten his business reputation. Your family deserves better than a relative who exploits grief and love for personal gain. I don't know if I can ever become the kind of person who deserves to have relationships with the people I hurt, but I'm going to use my time in prison to figure out how to live honestly and take responsibility for my choices. I hope you continue to thrive in your career and rebuild your relationship with Carol. You were stronger and smarter than I gave you credit for, and you fought for justice when it would have been easier to give up. Your father would be proud of how you defended his memory and your family's welfare. Sincerely, Whitney. After reading the letter, I sat in my apartment for a long time processing my complex feelings about Whitney's downfall. I felt vindicated that the truth had been exposed and justice had been served. I was relieved that her criminal behavior had been stopped before she could victimize other families or government programs. But I also felt sad for Thomas, who would grow up knowing that his mother's choices had cost him the chance to be raised by her. I felt sorry for Derek's parents, who had to step in to provide stability for a grandchild because their son's girlfriend had destroyed her own life through criminal behavior. Most of all, I felt grateful for the strength I had discovered in myself when everything seemed hopeless. Fighting back against Whitney's abuse had taught me that I was capable of protecting myself and standing up for my values even when the people closest to me had been turned against me. Whitney had intended to teach me that I was powerless against manipulation and psychological warfare. Instead, she had taught me exactly the opposite, that truth and justice are more powerful than lies and manipulation, especially when you're willing to fight for them with patience, evidence, and proper legal channels. Her letter didn't change anything about what she had done or the consequences she deserved to face, but it gave me hope that she might eventually become the kind of person who could have a healthy relationship with her son and contribute positively to society. Whether that happened or not was up to her. My job was simply to continue building the honest, independent life I had fought so hard to protect. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I was sitting in the coffee shop where I had stopped before that devastating day when Whitney destroyed my career. But this time, everything was different. I was wearing a professional outfit for my promotion interview to senior marketing director, carrying a portfolio of successful campaigns I had developed, and feeling genuinely optimistic about my future. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Ruthie, I'm so proud of you and everything you've accomplished. Good luck with your interview today. Dad would be so proud too." Our relationship had been slowly healing over the past months. Carol had entered therapy to understand how she had been manipulated and to work through her guilt about choosing Whitney over me during the crisis. She had also taken financial planning courses to ensure she would never again be vulnerable to the kind of exploitation Whitney had orchestrated. The recovery of my college savings had allowed me to begin graduate school part-time while working full-time. I was pursuing a master's degree in business administration with a focus on ethical leadership inspired by my experience of fighting corruption and manipulation in my own life. As I walked toward my office building, I thought about the letter I had received last week from Derek's parents. They had sent photos of Thomas, who was now a healthy, happy baby, surrounded by love and stability. The pictures showed him in a well-appointed nursery being held by grandparents who were committed to providing him with the honest, nurturing environment his mother had been unable to create. "Thomas is thriving," Susan Miller had written. "He's a curious social baby who responds well to routine and affection. We've been documenting his development for Whitney in case she's ever able to rehabilitate herself enough to have supervised visits. Derek has been an excellent father, and we're optimistic about Thomas's future." Whitney had been transferred to a minimum security facility where she was participating in job training programs and financial literacy courses. According to the updates Carol received from her attorney, Whitney was making progress on restitution payments and had maintained good behavior in prison. Whether she would ultimately become capable of healthy relationships remained to be seen. My promotion interview went better than I had dared to hope. The Jameson Industries account had exceeded all expectations, leading to additional contracts and recognition within the industry. When Jennifer offered me the senior director position with a substantial salary increase, I accepted with gratitude but not surprise. I had learned to believe in my own capabilities and value. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery to visit my father's grave. I had developed a habit of stopping by whenever I needed perspective on important decisions or simply wanted to feel connected to his memory. Today, I brought news about my promotion and updates about the recovery of our family's stability. "Dad, I want you to know that your Purple Heart and dog tags are displayed properly in my apartment now, along with your service photos and the flag from your funeral. Whitney tried to exploit your memory, but instead she ended up helping me understand what real honor and courage look like." I stood quietly for a few minutes thinking about the lessons I had learned through the most difficult period of my adult life. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their bad behavior or protecting them from the consequences of their choices. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish when someone is systematically trying to destroy your life. And I learned that sometimes the most mature thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. As I drove home, I reflected on how profoundly the experience with Whitney had changed my understanding of family relationships, personal boundaries, and moral responsibility. I had discovered that toxic people often accuse their victims of being selfish, ungrateful, or immature when those victims start defending themselves. Whitney had tried to convince everyone that my resistance to her manipulation was evidence of character flaws, when in reality it was evidence of healthy instincts for self-preservation. I had learned that enabling someone's destructive behavior is not the same as loving them. Carol's willingness to fund Whitney's lies and crimes had not helped Whitney become a better person. Instead, it had enabled her to continue down a path that ultimately cost her everything, including her relationship with her child. Most importantly, I had discovered that fighting for truth and justice requires patience, evidence, and proper legal channels, rather than emotional confrontations or attempts to fight manipulation with counter-manipulation. Whitney's downfall had come not from family drama, but from official investigations that examined facts rather than feelings. The experience had also taught me about the importance of building genuine support systems based on mutual respect and honesty. The friends who had abandoned me during Whitney's campaign of lies had not been true friends in the first place. The colleagues who welcomed me back after learning the truth were people worth maintaining relationships with throughout my career. As I settled into my apartment that evening, I thought about the support group I had started for survivors of family financial abuse. Every month, I met with 8 other people who had been victimized by relatives who exploited family loyalty for personal gain. Our group provided validation, practical advice, and emotional support for people recovering from sophisticated manipulation schemes. The hardest part, one group member had said recently, is accepting that someone you loved was deliberately hurting you for their own benefit. You keep wanting to believe that they meant well or that you misunderstood their motives. But accepting the truth about their intentions is what allows you to protect yourself and move forward, I had replied. As long as you're making excuses for someone's abusive behavior, you're vulnerable to continued exploitation. That night, as I worked on a research paper about ethical decision-making in crisis situations, I thought about the question I planned to pose to my social media followers the next day. I had been sharing my story gradually over the months, and it had resonated with thousands of people who had experienced similar family manipulation and financial abuse. My posts about fighting back against toxic relationships had generated overwhelming support and requests for advice. The next morning, I posted a message that summarized the most important lesson from my experience. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace in your family and protecting yourself from someone who was systematically hurting you? I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices, even when those people are family members. Real maturity isn't about tolerating abuse to avoid conflict. It's about standing up for your values and protecting your well-being even when manipulative people try to make you feel guilty for defending yourself. True family relationships are built on mutual respect and honesty, not exploitation and manipulation. People who genuinely love you don't want to hurt you for their own benefit, and they don't try to make you feel selfish for having boundaries. If you're dealing with a family member who lies, steals, or manipulates others, remember that you're not responsible for protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. You're only responsible for protecting yourself and building the honest, independent life you deserve. Thank you all for following my story and sharing your own experiences with family manipulation. Your support has meant the world to me during this journey toward healing and justice. Please like this post if it resonated with you, share it if you think it might help someone in your life, and subscribe to my page for more content about recovering from toxic family relationships. And please comment below with your own thoughts about setting boundaries with manipulative relatives. Remember, you are stronger than you think, you deserve better than abuse, and it's never too late to stand up for yourself and fight for the life you want to live. With gratitude and hope for everyone's healing journey, Ruthie. As I published the post and prepared for another day at my fulfilling career, I realized that Whitney had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself from anyone who tried to exploit my kindness or loyalty. She had intended to teach me that I was powerless against manipulation and psychological warfare. Instead, she had taught me exactly how powerful I really was when I chose to fight for truth, justice, and my own well-being. That was a lesson worth every moment of the struggle it had taken to learn it.